Thank you, Miguel. Thank you. Welcome back. Hopefully everyone is finishing their lunches. We apologize for the lack of vegetarian options. If anything's an issue, please come see one of us and we can find a way to accommodate you. All right. And again, as a reminder, we are recording this part of the talk. And then please stay with us a few minutes if you can after the keynote, as we'll just make a few upcoming announcements and ways to stay involved with SIPR. And thank you again to everyone who's attended and participated in the earlier panels. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Whitney Duncan. We've known each other now, I can't remember for how many years, working together to with folks at DU, other schools, and in community to create more of a landscape of immigration scholars in Colorado who are also deeply engaged in community. Whitney Duncan is an anthropologist, author, and activist whose creative and academic work centers on immigration, global mental health, and the intersections between culture, the body, and the natural world. Her books include Transforming Therapy, Mental Health Practice and Cultural Change in Mexico, which you can peruse but not take over there. And the forthcoming co-edited volume, which some of my students had the pleasure to read some preprints that she graciously shared with us, an edited volume, which she'll talk more about, called Accompaniment with Immigrant Communities, Ethnographic Engagements, co-edited with Kristen Yaris. And you can see some flyers over there to pre-order the book, which will be coming out this summer. Duncan is a professor of anthropology at the University of Northern Colorado, as well as so not too far from us, and an affiliate faculty at the Colorado School of Public Health. She was also a founding member of the Anthropologist Action Network for Immigrants and Refugees, or ANIR, which hopefully she'll also tell us a little bit more about. She volunteers with various immigrant-serving organizations and serves as an expert witness on asylum cases for the National Qualified Representative Program. If that wasn't enough, Whitney's also a member of the 2023-2024 Lighthouse Writers Workshop Poetry Collective and is at work on a poetry manuscript. Please help us give a warm welcome to Professor Whitney Duncan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Rebecca. And thank you so much for inviting me. I've already learned a great deal and have a lot of food for thought. I've really enjoyed the preceding presentations. And there's a lot of overlap in what we've already talked about today and what I am going to be talking about with you for this brief time I have with you. So let me just get set up here a little bit. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Can you hear me okay? All good? Okay. Everyone gotten enough food and rest and self-care in our brief break? All right. So I'm going to be talking about the practice of accompaniment today, specifically accompaniment with and among immigrant and migrant communities. But before I begin, what is accompaniment? So at the risk of catching you with full mouths, I want to elicit some audience participation to begin with. Just what are some words that come to mind when you think of accompaniment? And you can take that as broadly or as specifically as you want. What is accompaniment? Yes, Lisa. Companionship. Thank you. Any other words come to mind? Companionship. Yes, Miguel. Support. Companionship, support. Love it. Walk with. Thank you. And what's your name again? Cindy. Thank you, Cindy. Great. This is perfect. You're setting me up really well. Other words that come to mind with accompaniment, acompañamiento, if you're a Spanish speaker. Support, companionship, walking with, anything else? Sometimes people think of like musical accompaniment, right? Yeah. Liberation. Thank you. Yes. So I'm going to get into all of these things. These were perfect words to choose. I also, for this talk, I actually sent out an anonymous poll to some of the people in my network in the immigrant advocacy community, including immigrant leaders and members of various organizations in the Denver area. And so my question on this anonymous poll, which I just sent out last week because I knew I was going to be giving this talk and was really curious what the responses would be. My question was, in a few words or sentences, what does accompaniment mean to you? And I sent out this survey because although I have my own understandings of accompaniment, right, I've been thinking about this, this practice and this word for a long time and writing about it, but I am in no way an authority on it, right? Community is the authority on accompaniment, and I'm not attempting to offer any kind of definitive account, right, or foreclose any ways of thinking with or about the concept. So these responses that people sent in wound up being incredibly moving to me and very connected to the words that you all just pulled out as well. So I'm going to share some of those responses with you. Part of me wanted to just, sum them up, but they were so beautiful. I had to share them mostly in their entirety. So you mentioned Cindy walking with, right? That was one of the most repeated phrases in responses to the question of what does accompaniment mean to you? So walking with those who are marginalized, supporting them as they work for justice in their lives, walking alongside, again, that comes up, of someone providing emotional, physical, financial, spiritual support, focusing on the needs of the person being accompanied, not assuming what their needs and desires are, being present in the present for the person, emotional support, and this response was specifically about accompaniment in the court, in court proceedings. I'm going to keep going with this because I love these responses so much. This was a definition from a directly impacted person from an immigrant, saying that it was very important to me. This was also in reference to court, feeling the support. I felt brave, trusting, hopeful. Again, a walking alongside reference, welcoming and supporting, standing with and by. Being present, trusting in the capabilities, experience, and strength of the person or movement I accompany, responding to express needs with any resources or connections I might have, being clear and honest about what I do and do not know and will or will not do. Accompaniment means using my white and citizenship privilege as a vehicle for immigrants to have more access to power and decision makers or resources. I mean, so much of that one ties into what we've been talking about today in terms of understanding our own boundaries, our own positionality, right? Our own privilege, using privilege, knowing when to step back, et cetera. So all of these responses resonate really deeply with me. And I feel like I don't even need to give a talk now because the community just wrote it for me by providing these amazing survey responses. So I also just created a fun little word cloud to show us what are the most repeated words when people are asked this question. This is a small, this isn't a scientific study. This is just a community poll. But one thing I love about accompaniment as a framework is, and as a practice really, is how organic and open it is. Which means that while there might be some unifying concepts, and you can see those unifying concepts just in your responses and the responses from the poll, right? Accompaniment is active, it's ever changing, and it's diverse, right? And it's fundamentally rooted in relationships and local contexts. So if those are some community members' responses to the questions of what accompaniment means to them, what does it mean to me? I agree with all of the responses, but I want to share a little bit more about how I came to accompaniment and how my understandings have shifted over the years to give you a sense sort of what I'm bringing to this work. And I'll also get to a bit of background on and history of accompaniment more generally, which is going to connect to Dr. Roncorini's idea of liberation, right? Because this comes from liberatory traditions in Latin America. So in terms of early encounters I had with accompaniment before I would have called it that or knew what accompaniment was, in my book that Rebecca mentioned in the introduction on mental health in Mexico, which is over there, I actually wrote about globalization, the globalization of self-help. So also connected to the talk this morning, to Dr. Mitchell's talk. I also wrote that I view anthropological research and writing as a long process of being with, or convivencia. And I reflected that a central part of that experience was being conmovida, a word that frequently came up in emotional support groups that I attended in Oaxaca, Mexico, as part of my fieldwork on mental and emotional health in Mexico. So when they use this term, conmovida, the women in the support group were expressing the ways that they were moved with others. And they were really pointing to the ways that emotion and experience more generally are co-created and co-experienced, and how feeling with is also a form of being with. Also, going back even before that, doctoral fieldwork, the subject of my master's thesis was in linguistic anthropology, actually, and I wrote about the ways in which immigrant members of an emotional support group on the US-Mexico border in San Diego co-created empathy. So I've always been drawn to what I see as the emotional heart of ethnographic work. And I've been drawn to the centrality of presence with others. That is what drew me to anthropology and ethnography to begin with. And I think that this centrality of presence and feeling with others is also central to how I came to understand accompaniment. I've also always been drawn to methodologies that prioritize dialogue and the co-creation of knowledge, and that question our ethnographic and authorly authority. You know, who gets to tell the stories? Why me, right? I shouldn't get to tell the stories. And I think that questioning of authorly authority helps those of us living with various forms of privilege, including the privilege of being a researcher to begin with, right? Really understanding how we might take action in the world in solidarity with the people we work with, right? Due to broader inequalities, due to the colonial and often extractive nature of anthropology, like we were talking about this morning at our table, of social scientific research more generally, right? And just general inequalities in the world, researchers tend to be people in positions of great privilege compared to the people that they work with, right? And so there's always already an inequality built in and a potential for extractive, exploitative practices, right? So questioning that I've always been drawn to, but I say drawn to because as someone who was trained in pretty traditional forms of ethnographic research, I didn't know how to make good on those desires to show up with community in the ways that I knew I wanted to. It was very difficult to implement those approaches. They were actually actively sort of dismissed in my doctoral program. Even applied anthropology was dismissed as well. So I was working upstream in terms of the institutions that I was working within. I felt the usual pressures around grant writing, right, defending my dissertation, publishing traditional research articles and a manuscript, you know, that in order to get promotion or to get a tenure track job was going to need to be authored by me, right? So this incentive structure, like the panel before me was talking about, is already stacked against practices that are more horizontal and more about co-creating knowledge than about, you know, extraction, taking something and then, you know, analyzing it and becoming the quote unquote expert on it. So my ideas around this, and I really struggled with these questions for a long time. And through the writing of the book, Transforming Therapy, I was really dissatisfied in many ways that it wasn't more collaborative, that it wasn't more centered on actually helping to ameliorate some of the suffering that I was seeing. So I began to see a sort of path forward much more clearly around early 2017 when I started to work with the Denver-based Ni Una Más Deportación group. And so, yes, I think that was in the direct aftermath of the 2016 election. I had been involved in various ways in immigrant advocacy here in Colorado, but I really dove in at that point. So Ni Una Más, I want to tell you a little bit about Ni Una Más. And I have one of my compañeras from Ni Una Más here, Karina Urrego. Hi. So Ni Una Más is a subgroup of American Friends Service Committee. And it's a support and advocacy group for individuals and families in deportation proceedings. The group is composed of directly impacted immigrant members who provide accompaniment and mutual support, who engage in advocacy and trainings, and very crucially, who also seek to transform policy locally and nationally. And as I learned more about the accompaniment model that Ni Una Más and AFSC draw upon directly, I began accompanying Ni Una Más members to everywhere from ICE check-ins to court proceedings to doctor's visits as they navigated resources. We had direct actions and continue to have direct actions like marches, demonstrations, fasts, vigils. I realized that this was convivencia. This is what I had been writing about before, but kind of with teeth. This was acompañamiento. This was accompaniment. And it decentered my own role, right? My own quote unquote expertise. And it prioritized forms of relationality, of being with, collaborative action, mutual care, and also importantly, structural change. So this was accompaniment. And I learned from it very directly through my involvement with Ni Una Más. Also, the devastating crises that nearly all of the immigrants that I work with experienced at the outset of the pandemic profoundly changed how I do my work. It caused me to really shift and place accompaniment at the center of what I do, and not as something that is, what I do in my volunteer work on the side, but as what I do also as an anthropologist, as a faculty member, as a human in the world. At the time, I was in the midst of a multi-year National Science Foundation study of Latinx immigrant health in Colorado. My collaborator, Sarah Horton, and I shifted almost entirely toward accompanying folks as we sought to work with them to really meet the acute needs of the moment. And we were also simultaneously working together to try to affect changes in the programs and policies that were contributing to largely predictable and unavoidable crises that people were experiencing at COVID's outset, that they were already experiencing before that, right? And that were just intensified by that crisis. And so working at those sort of micro and macro levels simultaneously, that being with while explicitly trying to affect structural change has become fundamental to my own understanding and practice of accompaniment. So very unlike traditional forms of research, and as the blurb, I just screenshot the blurb about Ni Una Más from the AFSC website, and those are photos of some of our activities. And I started writing about accompanamiento, I think that was in I can't read the date, but around 2018, trying to consider what the group was doing. So like I said, I've been thinking about this for a long time, but I'm in no way the expert. I've learned from community organizers and directly impacted folks from the Ni Una Más group. And indeed, as I understand accompaniment in this context, it's really going to be taking its cues from directly impacted people, not from a predetermined research question, right? Not from an agenda, a pre-existing agenda, or an assumption about what people might want or need, or ideas about what they should want or need. And I think that can be very hard for some of us who are problem-oriented, trained in research to pose questions, to theorize, to answer questions and solve problems. So from there, we're attempting to collaboratively and very flexibly, as the panel preceding me was talking about, address what is at stake for the person or community in the moment, right? So this is where it's an emergent strategy, right? It's organic, it's coming out of the particular context and relationships that we have. So of course, acompañamiento is not at all new. So where did these ideas come from? This is not a comprehensive account, and some of you might have much deeper expertise in this question than I do. So I hope that during the discussion, you'll add parts that I missed, right, and share your experiences and thoughts about accompaniment. As far as I understand it, there are a couple sort of main antecedents. Primarily, we have Latin American liberation theology. And this quotation is one of my favorite descriptions of accompaniment. It's by, I believe they're two social workers that brings up this idea of walking alongside. So Latin American liberation theology, as far as I understand it, it was theologians Oscar Romero and Gustavo Gutierrez who first promoted or proposed acompañamiento as a biblically inspired approach in the Latin American tradition of the Second Vatican's call for service and solidarity with economically poor and politically oppressed communities in El Salvador and Peru, respectively. So amid the 1972 to 1992 US-backed armed conflict in El Salvador, Romero began what he called a ministry of accompaniment to urge people of faith to live in solidarity with and, quote, put themselves alongside the poor in their work toward collective liberation, right? So getting to the word liberation. And then Gutierrez and others emphasized how violence and suffering are patterned and they are rooted in oppressive structures that must be undone. So really from its inception, accompaniment has centered non-paternalistic forms of solidarity. It's prioritized being with, feeling with, and doing with people who tend to be situated at the margins of power and privilege. And this Latin American liberatory tradition also includes a very clear incitement to those with greater privilege to advocate for systemic change so that we have systems in which everyone can thrive. And I think that from this Latin American liberatory tradition, many social movements have taken up acompañamiento as an approach, as a framework for their work. So this has been central to many Latin American and internationalist social movements, working toward liberation from oppressive regimes, to end U.S. militarism and imperialism, also global human rights movements, social justice organizations, social medicine practice, sanctuary and environmental movements, social workers and psychologists, all are integrating accompaniment into their work. Even the underground movement for reproductive rights in Mexico uses an acompañamiento framework in order to help provide reproductive care to people who cannot access it. And since I'm an anthropologist, I think of the lineage of accompaniment within anthropology. And from the early 1990s, Nancy Shepherd-Hughes began drawing on her ethnographic work on child hunger in Northeast Brazil. And she really challenged anthropologists to abandon what was a disciplinary insistence on neutrality that was really fundamental to ideas of cultural and moral relativism. So she said, why should anthropologists be exempt from, as she put it, the human responsibility to take an ethical and even political stand on the working out of historical events as we are privileged to witness them? And Shepherd-Hughes has advocated for what she calls an active, politically committed, morally engaged, and even militant anthropology. So anthropology in this view should and could and probably should act as a force field, a site of struggle. She's used those terms to describe it. And anthropological writing, ethnography, can be a site of resistance in her view. And she brought an accompaniment framework to her work. Also, the late physician anthropologist Paul Farmer is probably the most well-known example of both engaged anthropology and social medicine designed from an accompaniment framework. So Farmer long called on medical anthropologists to understand health inequities as squarely within the structural forces, institutions, political, economic arrangements that render particular people more vulnerable to disease and death. And Farmer's work as an anthropologist and global health practitioner directly drew on Latin American liberation theology, which is where the term structural violence came from, and Farmer simply popularized it in his work and formed his organization, Partners in Health, around addressing the upstream challenges of structural violence using an accompaniment framework. Yet despite these antecedents and this long and involved history, there's not that much scholarly attention that has been paid to accompaniment. And this was surprising to me. So when Dr. Kristen Yaris at University of Oregon and I decided to try to delve deeper into accompaniment, we were surprised that there wasn't that much by way of scholarly engagement with this concept. So we decided to dig deeper, like I said, and we brought together other anthropologists, educators, students, activists, immigrants. Some of our contributors hold all of those identities simultaneously, or a few of them. And we wanted to consider what accompaniment is, how we practice it, and how it can act as a generative framework for ethnographic and activist engagement. So the book itself became a kind of an active accompaniment on its own, since all the anthropologists involved were part of, Rebecca had mentioned, our group Anthropologist Action Network for Immigrants and Refugees, that we started also in the aftermath of the 2016 election. We had our disciplinary meetings, our annual meetings right after the election, and there were a bunch of us sitting in a room feeling shell-shocked and helpless, and our students were afraid. Many people were afraid. The communities we worked with were afraid. We were afraid. And we decided to basically create a support group among us to try to figure out how to take action in solidarity. And our first big project was to try to organize on our campuses to make them sanctuary campuses that would be inhospitable to ICE coming onto our college campuses. And then since then, we meet regularly, provide emotional support and commiseration, strategize how to advocate effectively. We've provided op-eds and webinars, we've written op-eds and provided webinars. So the book was a coming together of some of the people in that group under this framework of accompaniment to really meditate on what it looks like and what are some of the challenges, et cetera. So it was also an act of accompaniment between and among those of us who co-authored with our immigrant and student collaborators, as many of us did. So my chapter is called Convivencia, Storytelling as Accompaniment, Activism, and Care, which I co-authored with two Ni Una Más members, Erika Vargas and Lupe Lopez, who wanted to be here today but couldn't make it. So how do we frame accompaniment in the volume? Really similarly to how we've been talking about accompaniment. We discuss it as ethnographic accompaniment because those of us who, spearheaded this particular project identify as anthropologists, but I think most of what I'm discussing is relevant regardless of your affiliation or lack thereof with anthropology. So we discuss ethnographic accompaniment as what we call a relational stance of alignment. So emphasizing that being with, emphasizing trust and intentional community building as a way of relating and enacting social change, and specifically for advocating for justice. So in the process, we explicitly tried to bring together feminist ethics of care and decolonial critiques of anthropology and the social sciences more generally, which have called anthropologists and social scientists, right, to act in ways, be them large or small ways, to hold space and challenge systems of oppression. So accompaniment is trying, in the way that I view it at least, to break down very intentionally what we tend to see in academia as fixed boundaries between care work and knowledge production, and between social theory and social action. So as Dr. Mitchell discussed, for decades, feminist theory and praxis has really emphasized the central importance of care and care work, right? Self-care, both self-care and care of and with others. And has also prioritized lived experience as a site of theorization. Like, we get many of these ideas around positionality and reflexivity from feminist theory, which has long questioned, whether we can ever be objective, right? Whose perspectives are we reading in the canon, of course, right? Who gets to tell the stories, whose labor and whose voices matter? Along with feminists, decolonial scholars, and we also heard about this in Dr. Mitchell's talk and in the preceding panel, right? Decolonizing the academy, decolonizing social sciences. This work is going on in all sectors. And we wanted to bring that to this conversation about accompaniment, because decolonial scholars and activists have been long calling attention to how the humanities, the social sciences, research more generally emerge from what I was talking about as those extractive, often racist, sexist, patriarchal, and colonial legacies. So decolonized methodologies, as many people have been pointing out over the past decade plus, resist those extractive forms of data collection and knowledge production. So instead, really focusing on lived experience of those at the margins. So as Bejarano and colleagues talk about it, decolonized methodologies are ways of learning with, from, and alongside those with whom we work, not of learning and theorizing and writing and publishing and teaching about them, right? So again, coming back to that more horizontal view of what this work can be. So accompaniment can be a mode of knowledge production, right? Where we're producing things that people will read and teach, which, you know, I hope people do read and teach this book. But the type of knowledge it produces is very different in many cases from what research typically produces. So in accompaniment, we are explicitly questioning whose knowledge counts and what counts as knowledge, right? How is providing care in community, creating communities of care, as Dr. Mitchell talked about, a valid form of knowledge production, right? Who can value that and who can put themselves out there to advocate that those activities be valued in our institutions? But also quite beyond just producing knowledge, accompaniment explicitly is an ethical commitment that calls us to action, right? And so when prior panels were talking about like, well, I can't not do this work, right? A number of people in this room have said that. That is that ethical commitment. And accompaniment does not understand that to be a sort of side project. Like that's at the center of the thing, is our ethical commitment to be with, to walk alongside. So we call it in the volume a collaborative caring ethnography that blooms out of relatedness and that prioritizes presence, trust, and social relations. So how does accompaniment actually work? I mean, I wish I could provide a comprehensive how-to to get off the ground, and I don't even think I need to in this room because many of you already do this work. And I hope, again, you'll share some of your experiences with it. Accompaniment can look a whole lot of ways, right? So even just in the volume that we have everything from collaborative storytelling as collective healing in the chapter that Lupe, Erika, and I wrote. We have a chapter on building an immigrant bond fund in collaboration and accompaniment with community-based organizations. We have the co-creation of a bilingual homework hotline during the pandemic. We have examples of micro advocacy and people advocating together with community for broader policy change. We have immigrants and Indigenous organizers as first authors. We have poetry and song in there. It's quite a diverse volume. And we wanted that to be the diverse and organic context-dependent nature of accompaniment to really be reflected in what we produced. So in the conclusion to the book, we don't really have a conclusion because, as I said, we're not trying to be, to foreclose other ways of thinking or provide some sort of definition or how-to guide so much as really asking questions and posing provocations. But we do have a brief chapter about putting accompaniment into practice. I think that's the one your students might have read. So hopefully it won't be repetitive to those of you who maybe took that class where you've already read it. It's very short, and I just wanted to talk about some of the sort of components that we pulled out, central aspects of accompaniment that might help us in our discussion of how accompaniment can look and some of the challenges that arise when we practice accompaniment. So first and foremost, and this has also come up in prior panels, is the showing up and the being with, right? That is fundamental to the practice of accompaniment. So I'm actually training to become a meditation instructor. I didn't put that in my bio, but this is a practice that I hope to bring to my accompaniment work as well, to the Neo-Namas group and other forms of accompaniment. But one thing we talk about in mindfulness is beginner's mind, right? This is sort of a well-known concept within Buddhism as well. And this is simply showing up in the present moment without preconceptions or assumptions, which sounds easy and, as we all know, is very, very hard. And I think accompaniment really requires this of us, this beginner's mind. It's perhaps particularly challenging for those of us who might identify as researchers or problem solvers or project-oriented, results-oriented people, right? I think that training, while it has so many strengths and allows us so many superpowers, also can sometimes ironically obscure or weaken the power of accompaniment, right? Because we're coming to the situation with so many ideas about how things should be, or what people want, what people need. So of course, if I show up thinking I already know what is needed, right, or what policy we need to push for, if I bring my own judgments to the interaction, I'm not so much walking alongside as pushing or pulling the situation. And I may be acting as the authority, even as I'm saying that I'm practicing these decolonial, we're on equal footing practices, right? How am I bringing my positionality as an expert to this dynamic and reproducing unknowingly some colonial or paternalistic dynamics that I don't really want to be a part of? So showing up and being with this beginner's mind entails deep listening. And I think, that was reflected in so much of what we've heard of today and with the community engagement projects. I mean, I think every panelist said, like, it's showing up, it's volunteering, it's asking, how can I help, right? Just from the beginning. And I'll get to how that becomes challenging given the institutional incentive structures that many of us have. So showing up and being with also sometimes means showing up in spaces that are unfamiliar or deeply uncomfortable. And so that requires us to be aware, like Dr. Mitchell talked about, of our positionality, of our privilege, of the forms of oppression to which we are subject, taking good care, right? And also reflecting on why we feel discomfort, why we feel uncomfortable. What does this have to say about certain dynamics of power that we may be replicating or that we may be subject to? And so this is related to another important aspect of accompaniment that, again, I love how it all fits together today, that Dr. Mitchell talked about, is acknowledging and digging deep into power and positionality. So working in an accompaniment framework really asks us to be constantly reflecting on our positionality, on the different identities we occupy, how power can shapeshift depending. It's not like this is not a fixed thing. When we're filling out our different the different aspects of our positionality, like that might look different next week than it does today. And that might look different in different contexts, right? That in certain rooms, we have more power and authority, and in other rooms, we don't have that, right? So it's reflecting on that, what we're bringing to these contexts and relationships. And we might, in some situations, really lean into the power we occupy. So going back to one of those community definitions from before, like using my privilege of whiteness and citizenship to like lean into that power and help people get access to power, to decision makers, right? Like maybe I want to lean into my identity as an expert to say like, look, you need to do better, City of Denver, in terms of promoting your COVID vaccines, because it's not, I'm a medical anthropologist who works with the Colorado School of Public Health and I say I'm an expert, you need to do this, right? Like there's some rooms in which you want to own that authority as you are advocating for justice and for programs that can try to avoid some of the disparities that we see every day. Other times that we might want to distance ourselves from our academic or institutional power, if we have those. We might instead foreground our alignments in terms of identity or shared identities with community members, right? One that comes to mind a lot for me is shared experience as a mother, right? That provides a certain way of relating with other mothers in the neo-Namas group, right? In those instances, like there's nothing about the fact that I'm a professor or hold a PhD that is really relevant to the situation, right? So in what situations do we lean into or potentially pull away from or reflect on power and privilege? Similarly, and this also just goes to questions of self-care and care of others. Sometimes we're going to lean into our accompaniment, really be able to dig in, right, and devote ourselves as much as possible to particular, causes or projects or moments of crisis that people are experiencing. But also recognizing our positionality means knowing that our ability to do this work is going to wax and wane, ebb and flow with time and with our own life circumstances, and to know that this is normal, right? This is expected. This is not like you are doing a bad job if you take your time for yourself to show up with your kids or whatever that might look like. So this also involves the importance of building networks of support and solidarity that we can fall back upon those communities of care so central to preventing any kind of burnout, and that allow us to step back when needed and let other people take on load if they are able. So I talked a little bit earlier about this. The way accompaniment tends to, one thing that I really love about this framework, as I understand it, is that accompaniment works at all levels, right? In this, your disciplinary language you might use the words like you're working at the micro, the meso, the macro level, right? In anthropology, I might think more about levels of structural violence and lived experience. Doesn't really matter, right? You see all these different levels of experience, right? From the individual to communal, cultural, social, political, economic, right? Like we're moving across these levels and doing that simultaneously, right? So working in ways that might be seen or understood as forms of micro advocacy, but not only working in those ways, simultaneously understanding that the reason that people are often in certain crises is because of the structural factors that made them vulnerable to those crises. So it requires of us to also work at that more macro structural level to change the policies, to change the programs that made people vulnerable to begin with. So whether that's immigration policy, whether that's how a particular program involves barriers that prevent people from being able to access them, like what in any given moment is happening on these different levels, and how can we use our superpower of being with, of accompaniment, both to create relationships and healing in the moment and to make broader change. So this multi-scale approach, I think, is something that distinguishes accompaniment from some forms of volunteerism or casework even, which may be very good at meeting the moment, which is central to accompaniment, but which might not always cause us to look or require us to look at those broader contexts, right? To try to affect the more structural and policy changes that need to be made to prevent people from being structurally vulnerable to begin with. So it's working across scales. And this is one thing that I love about the AFSC and the neo-Namas model, that we are explicitly being together, walking alongside each other, and using the group as a form of emotional support, but also very explicitly going to the Capitol, whether that's of Colorado or the nation, to advocate for particular policies and to make change, and seeing how understanding people's lived experiences and stories can add richness and be compelling to lawmakers has been really profound. I mean, watching my compañeras in UNAMAS speaking at the Capitol, it is so inspiring. They are such badass organizers, and I have learned so much from them in terms of how they are really calling upon this inner strength that is so impressive to me to advocate for structural change so that people don't have to experience the types of family separations or unremitting fear that they have experienced. So in that group, we're working, at all these different levels. There's also the capacity building level of like how, when Karina goes to DC, right? Like she's advocating, she's telling her story in ways that are part of the capacity building of the organization to send people to places of power and make sure that their voices are heard by those who are making the decisions, which unfortunately are usually not the people that are affected by those decisions. Also, sharing the results of our work across multiple scales is, I think, essential to this. Speaking to different stakeholders. So that might be that what we produce is, I love producing a cookbook, right? I love producing stories that are for someone's family, right? To have a family record. Like that is profound work of accompaniment, I think. And we can't, I think, understate the importance of accompaniment at what we might see as micro levels. Got a panel Rebecca and I were on a few weeks ago. We were asking the question of like, well, micro to whom, right? Like it might be micro from some sort of like very zoomed out structural perspective, but if we're talking about impacting the lives of someone that we are walking alongside, that is a macro experience to them, right? And really, I think holding space is a profound act of accompaniment. But again, is of course not mutually exclusive with working for those broader forms of structural change. So sharing the stories and results of our work across multiple scales in different formats, right, that are going to be accessible to broader publics, be them, the families of directly impacted people or directly impacted people themselves, be that policymakers, students, right? Like, how do we produce work that we were asked, like, how many people have read our students' papers? Like, no one, right? How many people have read our academic articles? Like, I mean, a few. I mean, I don't think anyone has actually read my dissertation from beginning to end except me. Well, right? Like I was saying earlier, like my own mother hasn't read my book. And that's another story that I won't get into. But we need to, of course, and we've been saying this for a long time, write in ways that are accessible, that matter to broader publics. Otherwise, what is the point, really, right? Like, we can advance our discipline and get our promotion, and that is important on a personal level. But of course, and I think being experimental and creative, right? Like, maybe this form of accompaniment, this particular project, like what it needs is a bunch of TikTok videos to go out. Now, it's not going to be me that's doing that, because I don't know how to, I don't TikTok or whatever. Is that a verb? No, I'm really sounding lame. But right, that might be a decision that's going to be the way to get it more accessibly recognized, right, into the hands of people who will consume it, right? Maybe that is using digital storytelling or creating a website or using collage. Maybe that's poetry, right? Maybe that's an op-ed or a policy paper. It just depends. And so that's where the organic, the flexibility comes in as well. It's not just in terms of how we design the project and how we do the accompaniment, but what we produce from it. So those of you who are faculty or in different positions that value or reward more typical forms of academic production, and we've touched on this today, of course, you might be thinking that this is all well and good, like accompaniment is a great model, and also I have to get tenure, right? So I think that again, Dr. Roncarini spoke to this, right? The institutional challenges that many of us face. And that would be for students, right, faculty, staff, et cetera, but also in particular community-based organizations or nonprofits, right, where you have certain requirements of the job that, as Karina was saying earlier, may or may not be in line with your values, right? So I can speak more to the institutional challenges within academia because that's where I live. So the ways in which accompaniment might ask us to deprioritize a research question, abandoning sort of pre-existing assumptions, is going to run very counter to the incentive structures that most of us have. And this can feel really transgressive and liberating and like, yeah, let's do this thing. And it can also be completely terrifying because our livelihood and careers often depend upon publishing widely cited yet never read academic articles, getting external grants, producing a body of work that is seen as valuable by the academy. I've been fortunate to work in a department and a college that at least says that they value community engagement. DU seems like a place that really values community engagement, but not all of us are in departments or institutions that have those same values. And many institutions explicitly frown upon anything that is not your typical scholarly research forms of production. And oftentimes accompaniment is not legible, right, as a practice of research. So it's often unvalued or lumped with community service, which, that also gets valued, right? And I want to acknowledge that my whole ability to make these critiques, right, and to dedicate myself to this idea of accompaniment and to accompaniment work is largely rooted in my privilege of tenure, right? And tenure is under attack in many institutions. There are many contingent faculty that do not have the option for tenure. And I also have sets of unearned privileges that by virtue of my race, my citizenship, my socioeconomic status, all of this comes together to put me in a position where I can say, I don't need to produce the types of research articles that you want me to, at least not anymore, right? Because of that privilege of tenure. And I will also want to acknowledge that accompaniment is not feasible for everybody. And even for those of us for whom it might be feasible sometimes, it's not going to be feasible all the time. And that's sort of understanding our own positions, of course, to be able to step in and out of type of work as we are able. That being said, part of why we wanted to write this book in the first place was to, it's published by an academic press, right? We wanted to go through the peer review process so that this is precisely to validate this kind of work, make this approach visible in the eyes of the academy so that when students are designing their, master's or doctoral projects, they can point to this and say that this is a strategy that scholars who have been recognized by the academy say I can do, like giving permission, which shouldn't be necessary, but unfortunately is. And this can be, I'm not saying this because I want you to cite the book, but it can be cited as you are writing grant applications, right? To say like, this is a valid approach, can be a valid approach in the eyes of the academy. Those of us who do have academic privilege can also do a lot, I think. It depends on our position within our institution, but to call upon our colleagues in our universities, our departments, our journals, and our book editors to include also our tenure and promotion committees, right? To include accompaniment, to include activism and community engagement as part of what we are being evaluated on. To value care work, not just as something that we need to apologize for or do on the side and become utterly burned out, but as part and parcel or central to the actions that we're involved in, central to our work. So some of us have had success advocating for accompaniment in our institutions by demonstrating how it is in line with, it promotes and embodies DEI efforts. Right. So really using the language of the institutions, some institutions still value DEI, fortunately. I think DU is one of them. My university says they're one of them as well. So you can use that language, right, to also say like, look, you want me to promote DEI in my work? Like, here is an example of that, right? I am explicitly decolonizing research methodologies, and that is part of being inclusive, right, on a diverse campus that values inclusion. So all of this we hope will begin to, maybe in a very small way, begin to undo these oppressive hierarchies that we operate within, these colonial structures of academia, and to foster more community-based and community-driven forms of knowledge production that I think are so important and central to the work that many of us in this room want to do. So I want to conclude by sharing one last community definition of accompaniment that I thought very beautifully summed up a lot of what I just discussed. And this community member, these are also some photos of Neonamas actions. This community member wrote that accompaniment is a pillar of support, emotional, spiritual, and as part of the struggle for justice, to walk together in the process of resilience that characterizes migrants, sharing pain and knowledge to combat the oppressive system and achieve justice and equal rights together. Thank you all so much. Really looking forward to your own thoughts on accompaniment and any questions. And also, you can scan this QR code for 35% off of the book. We are donating all of the author proceeds to immigrant serving organizations in Colorado and Oregon, where my co-editor works. And after 1 year, it will be open access, which is awesome. But get your libraries at least to buy it while it costs money so that the immigrant serving organizations can get the proceeds. And I have some flyers as well on the table. All right. Thank you all so much. Oh, there's 3. Oh, other mic.
Thank you, Whitney. Oh, I'm really loud. But that's helpful with the recording. Are there any questions for Whitney or even comments?
Or accounts of your own views on or experiences of accompaniment?
Maybe no. Any comments, questions, reflections? Okay, we got one. Sometimes you have to give a little bit of pause.
I'm not going to be able to piece it all together because my brain is lagging. But yeah, I really appreciated this talk. I think one of the things that I think about for me personally in doing this work as somebody who also has like an immigrant experience is this accompaniment thing really made me think of how like walking together is also part of that like community healing that can happen. I have a bit of a background in restorative justice, so I was thinking about a lot of what you shared and how it's really shown up in that and helping people process harm when it happens. And I think accompaniment, I've been able to do in that realm. And it's been interesting to like leverage the power I have with powerful partners like our police officers or police departments and sharing lived experience and not having to give away like who the person was that had that experience. So yeah, I really appreciated. Definitely gonna get the book. Thanks.
Awesome. Feel free to wait till it's open access, but yeah, get the discount code if you're not going to wait. Thank you. Yeah, I think that element of healing is really central to the practice. And I think it's sort of a different but related topic in terms of how our individual forms of therapy, I think, are often not up to the task of that communal healing that is needed when there is such a history of trauma among, many of us, and definitely folks that are experiencing the immigration system that we have, right? And I've talked to many people who are like, yeah, I tried therapy, and they were like, giving me the typical therapeutic recommendations. I'm like, do you even understand that, my family has been separated and broken apart, and my kids are self-harming because of a result of this system, right? Like, so individual forms of therapy can't address those more structural changes, nor do they often have really understanding of what people are going through. And so that's where I think community forms of mutual care and understanding can be so powerful.
Hi, Whitney. Thank you so much. I'm Rebecca Zuniga. I'm from the Denver Justice and Peace Committee. And we, in the past, during the 80s, did a lot of accompaniment in Guatemala, in places like Guatemala, with a sister organization, the Network in Solidarity with Guatemala. This was in a peace building situation. So you brought up Monsignor Romero and other. So this decolonization of this process that we've been involved in for many decades is, I really appreciate that you all took the time to put this in writing and getting the peer review that allows us organizers to bring to the table these words that sometimes mean nothing to other folks that haven't had this experience of being in side by side with people that are struggling for different reasons. So this is very contextual to the immigrant communities here, but us that have done it in the past, 20, 30 years also appreciate what you have done. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it's such a rich tradition that, like I said, I think many people, especially in the scholarly world, right, of research, do not really get exposed to. I wasn't exposed to it until I started, delving into what accompaniment is and where it came from. And I'm not an expert on Latin American liberation theology, so I've gotten to learn a lot and have been really humbled by the ways accompaniment has been used in those settings in Latin America.
Oh, so I host Ukrainian meetups every month, and Ukrainians have a lot of stigma against mental health support. And so this kind of accompaniment is perfect for them. And when you don't have to call it a support group or seeing a psychologist, because they won't sign up for that, but they will come and share their stories. They might start talking about life in the United States, but then usually by the end of the meetup, it's sometimes can be pretty heavy what they're sharing. And it's so important for them to be with other people who understand them and share their experiences. So this is great to have a book that kind of validates that.
Yeah, I think that's really true that it's a community-based form of care and being with that does not require us to call it by any name that might be stigmatized, right? It also allows us to meet the moment depending on what is happening there. And I think also you might be interested in looking into forms of like testimonial therapy, though it has the word therapy in it, but has been used also with various groups to process in a community setting some of what they have gone through oftentimes. And it can utilize sort of pre-existing ways of healing that do not assume that the sort of Euro-American Western forms of therapy are like how we process trauma or how we even experience trauma. But I think holding those questions really closely is super important because we might assume that that certain groups that trauma is universal, right? And in many ways it is, but there are different experiences of it and different community-based ways of approaching it and healing that might not square with sort of more traditional psychological ways. That's a main piece of what I wrote about mental health in Mexico. Is like, yeah, there's stigma, and also there's a lot of stigma against traditional forms of care that have existed for millennia to actually help people heal. So it's sort of how we talk about it that has a big effect on, you know, what stigma even is, I think. But yeah, thank you. I love hearing about those meetups.
Any other questions? Okay.
This is more of a question about things you learned by writing the book.
Mhm.
Anything that were your big takeaways for you that kind of surprised you?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think first is what I mentioned of how deep and long this tradition is, as Rebecca was talking about as well, and how little, you know, I've been an anthropologist now for, I don't know how many years, right? And I hadn't heard about accompaniment until, and, you know, a lot of my colleagues worked in social justice work and human rights movements in Latin America. So had, like Kristen, who I co-edited the book with, had that experience, but I did not. And so understanding that tradition and its antecedents was surprising to me, and surprising to me that it hadn't been really elevated, even among those of us who do advocacy work or applied work in various settings. So that was surprising to me. I think just it was also surprising to me how open to and excited about the project the press was. Like, our editor has been very supportive, and we came to her being like, is she gonna, you know, this isn't really your typical scholarly project, right? Like, what, they were very supportive. And I think that says a lot about the press. It's University of Arizona Press. So that surprised me. I'm trying to think of other aspects. I'm going to keep thinking about it. Getting to know my colleagues' work more deeply and their co-authors was really fascinating. So I think how flexible accompaniment is surprised me, like just the diversity of projects that are featured in the book was like, on the one hand, I was like, does this mean that accompaniment is just everything, right? And does that make it meaningless? But I think the way that we, you know, as we got the chapters in and could see what tied them together, and that the beauty was in the diversity, but that there were strains that go throughout the book, right? And I think there are things that distinguish accompaniment from other forms of engaged methodologies, from, you know, that distinguish it from social work, et cetera. So yeah, the diversity of the approach and how receptive community members generally are to it, and how healing it tends to be, even though it's not explicitly therapeutic, right? So similar to what you were saying, right? And this is something that struck me about ethnography, and just in all the years I've been doing it, is how so many people that I talk to, even if it's in an interview setting for a research setting, say once we're done with that particular interview, just how therapeutic it was just to share a story, right? Just to be seen and heard in your moment. And I think that making that a central part of the being with that accompaniment allows us to do is really powerful. And it also says, like, unapologetically, that yes, there is healing in being with, in people walking together and alongside each other. And we don't have to be professional therapists to show up and meet the moment with people.
Do we have more questions? Okay.
Well, thank you so much to Whitney. We'll just give
Thank
maybe
you all.
another concluding thought for the panel, unless there's anything you'd like to end with, Whitney.
I don't think so.
All right,
No, I
well,
just
thank
really
you.
Appreciate the opportunity and the questions, and thank you for having me.